Picture this. The journey ahead starts here together, and together we can build a brighter future. You are listening to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. Newsom is a resilient single mother of two daughters who has faced numerous life challenges as a single mom, dealing with mental health issues and the trauma of her parents' murders. She has endured significant hardships through her mother's tragic death, an abusive marriage, and a co-parenting relationship marked by narcissistic abuse. Anna has emerged with a renewed dedication to advocating for women who cannot speak for themselves. She is committed to raising awareness about domestic violence and providing support in any way she can. Anna Newsom, welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
You have a lot of layers.
Oh, yeah.
Of a story.
Yes.
So first I want to paint a picture of your childhood. So talk to me about your childhood with your parents.
Yeah, so I was raised by my dad and my stepmom. They were pretty middle class, working. My stepmom went back to nursing school when I was 11. My dad stayed home with us, but he had an alcohol addiction and pill addiction. So I was pretty much the one bathing my brothers and sisters, pouring his alcohol down the sink while my stepmom was working. We just lived a very simple life. Like, she kept a lot of the struggle with my dad and her marriage quiet. We didn't know a lot that was going on. I mean, we saw stuff, obviously. But yeah, I mean, it was pretty normal. I really didn't have a lot of trauma besides my dad's addiction until her death.
Okay, so talk to me then about your relationship with your biological mom.
Yeah, so my parents divorced when I was 1, and my stepmom met my dad when I was 3, and I had just lived with my dad and my stepmom. I don't really know the semantics of how it played out, but then I did have my mom in my life, but it was like an every other weekend summer visitation kind of thing. But my day-to-day life and like where I was raised was my dad and my stepmom's house.
So your stepmom was basically mom
Yes.
to you as a child growing up.
I mean, I would say I had 2 moms, but my day-to-day parenting, was my stepmom for sure.
What happened? What was the dynamics after your parents, your dad and your stepmom, divorced? What happened after that?
Okay, so my dad was in and out of rehabs and, like I said, his addiction, and my stepmom had always told me that she stayed in the marriage for me because she was a 21-year-old single woman when she met my dad. So I was her first child, really. And so she said, I stayed in the marriage because I wanted you. And I was 16 when she finally was like, I can't do this anymore. He needs help. I was on board with that. At that point, when you become a teenager and you live with an addictive parent, you're like, okay, yep, it's cool. Go on. So I was 16. He gave my stepmom guardianship of me. He did that without a fight. My biological mom, at that point, I'm a junior in high school. And I was in the same town as my biological mom, so she didn't have an issue with it either. And I stayed living with my stepmom. I became a teen mom a year after that. I got pregnant when I was 17. And so it was just, she was working, she was a single mom, I was pregnant. And then when that happened, she moved one of her best friends into our home. So it was her childhood best friend who was also a single parent, but she didn't have her kids regularly. So it was just 2 women in the household and me and my brother and sister.
And then did your stepmom move on after your dad?
She had a couple boyfriends. I only met one of them. He stayed with us for a while, but didn't last very long. And then she had started dating her last boyfriend. His name was Sean. I want to say like the winter, spring of 2010. So like a few months before she passed.
And what was the dynamics of that relationship? Do you know much about it?
What I know is my stepmom worked at Liberty Hospital as a nurse. We grew up an hour north of KC. So on the days, most nurses would lump their days together. So her 12-hour shift, she'd be in the city for 3 days. She had an apartment. And then a couple months before her death, she decided to take on a bartending job, which was a bar in Cameron where he hung out and lived. So then she started staying with him instead of her apartment, but he only came to our house one time. So I only met him really briefly in passing once.
You mentioned your mom's death. Talk to me about what happened.
I remember it was Halloween of 2010, and I was really upset with her because my baby was 6 months old. It was her first Halloween. And my stepmom was starting to come in. She was 36 years old. So I'm only 32. That's really young, to have an 18-year-old child and an 11 and 13-year-old child. Like, she still had pretty young kids, but they were old enough she could start having some freedom. And I was starting to get annoyed by that. I respect it that we weren't around this man, especially now that we know what's come from it. But, you know, you start to get a little animosity. Like, you want your mom to have fun, and you don't realize at 18, like, everything she's gone through to be able to have this moment in her life. I was a little upset with her, because it seemed like he was always a thing. Like, oh, we're going to go to Worlds of Fun on Halloween instead of trick or treat. Oh, we're going to stop in Cameron and have dinner with Sean. Like, I stayed home by myself with my child. And so I was a little upset with her. The night before, she had gone down for a work meeting. So she was staying with him. And I was upset still from Halloween. That was just 2 or 3 days prior to her death. She died on the 4th of November. So when she had called that night, I didn't really speak to her. She called to check on all of us, and I was like, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. And the next day I went to college. My daughter stayed home with my mom's best friend that lived with us, and then I went to work. I was leaving work, and I went to call her on my way home, and she didn't answer, and I was like, okay, well, I'll talk to her when I get home. She's on the phone. And when I walked in the door, her friend said, have you talked to your mom today? I was like, no, I just tried calling her. And she said, well, she's not home, and she was supposed to be at a work meeting at 10, and then or 8 or something early, and then come back home to volunteer at my sister's. They had like a CARES day where it's like a volunteer for the middle school, and she didn't show. Now, that I got off work at 8 o'clock at night, so this is all day. Now, like I said, my stepmom was coming into her own and having her own freedom, but when it came to our lives, she would never choose that over a responsibility. So her being a parent volunteer and not showing up was not like her. So anyway, we tried calling her. Jennifer is the best friend, so I'll just call her Jennifer from now on. Jennifer said that she had talked to the boyfriend and said, hey, have you heard from Angela? She hasn't came home. He's like, oh no, she left this morning and went to work. I haven't seen her since. And we just started getting like, you're the last one to see her, and she's missing, and this is not like her. Like, what's happening? And we're not talking like a couple hours. Like, she was supposed to be home at 10, 11 noon, and it's 8 o'clock at night. We just decide to get in the car, and me, the baby, and the friend, my stepmom's friend, and drive to Cameron to look for her. So we went by his house, went by the bar that she worked at, went by his grandma's. No sign. So I'm getting fed up at this point. I'm starting to get worried. And I have never talked to him, but I got his number from the friend, and I texted him, and this is one of my regrets, and said, I'm going to the police. Something's not right. I know that you were the last one to see my mom, and I'm going to the police. And that was when, well, to fast forward, he had already killed her at this point, and that's when he burnt the body that night after I sent that text message. I sent that text. I don't know that, obviously, at the time. I send the text. I go to the police department, and we're like, what do we do? Like, I guess, missing persons report. Like, it's only been a few hours. I'm really grateful for Chillicothe Police Department. They took me seriously. They didn't do what her brother did to me and my other uncle did to me when I called them and said she was missing. Oh, she's on a bender. She's partying. She's this, she's that. She's fine. And I couldn't get it out what I was feeling. Like, I'm like, no, this is not fine. No, she's not on a bender. Like, she's missing. Something is wrong.
All the while you're or young adult.
Yeah, barely 18. I turned 18 in July, and this is November. So barely 18, in college with a 6-month-old baby. So I'm a single mom. A lot going on.
And you also had younger siblings.
11 and 13. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, were those her kids
and
with your dad?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, there was 3 of us all together. Mm-hmm. That night, it was like the weirdest Twilight Zone feeling. You don't know what's going on. You know she's not calling you back. You know that something is wrong, but you have no idea what it is. And I will say, through the whole process, that's probably where my mind shut down and protected me from the pain that was coming. I mean, I remember I couldn't sleep. I remember laying there and be like, is she in a basement somewhere? Is she in a car wreck somewhere? Like, the unknown. And when I hear stories of women that are missing forever, and just that missing, it's the worst part in the beginning. So the next morning, take my brother and sister to school. I don't say anything, because what do you say? Good morning, go to school, mom's missing. Like, my sister has a little animosity towards me. We've worked it out that I didn't tell her, that I just sent her to school. Because I got to have that closure of talking to the police and being in the investigation from start to finish. I said,
how old was she?
13.
Right. You obviously did the right thing. Right.
And I've always felt more like a parent to them because of my dad's addiction. My stepmom was the breadwinner, so she had to work. I was home with them. So I just felt more of like their parent than their sister, especially after this incident. So then that morning, we don't know what to do. So stepmom had a great group of friends. And they were in a bike club. They're really good people. So we go to Cameron with a whole bunch of bikers, and just so happened one of their club friends had an apartment across the street from the house he killed her at. Again, at this point, we don't know he killed her. We just know that was his grandma's house, and we conveniently had a friend. So we're in this apartment complex in the parking lot, just like doing a stakeout. I don't know what we were doing. Waiting for the police. At this point, they had picked up the boyfriend and were interrogating him at Highway Patrol in St. Joe. So we're just waiting. Why we wanted to be at the, I guess, literal scene of the crime, but we didn't know it was a scene of the crime. I think everything just works out kind of like that. So we're sitting there waiting. The best friend, Jennifer, that I talked about, who went with me through all of this, was there, and they were all kind of falling apart. My dad showed up intoxicated or whatever medicine he took, so everyone around me is just unwell. It's traumatic. I understand. So I'm looking around, I'm like, I can't fall apart because who's going to handle this? Stepmom had a sister and a brother. My grandparents at this point were elderly. So I didn't feel like it was my place to call them and alert them to this. Again, I'm a child. I'm like, let me call the siblings and they can deal with their parents and I'll go find mine. My stepmom's sister was a flight attendant. Well, she still is. And so she was in the air and I called her husband at the time. And he was the one that immediately told me, I'm not going to bother her. Angela's on a bender. Angela's drunk somewhere. She'll come home. Not going to bother her with this. Called my uncle. Kind of the same thing. I don't know when they told my grandparents. I didn't tell them. But I kind of knew then I was on my own here. Her siblings aren't around or have their opinions, so they're kind of not taking it seriously. My dad, her ex-husband, off his rocker right now, you know, and again, it's traumatic. Some people aren't equipped to handle hard things, especially when you're an addict. You go to your addiction before feeling the pain. Totally understand. I'm recovering alcoholic, so I get that. So as I'm watching everyone, I'm just like, I gotta be strong. I mean, it's like a scene from, you have the best friend on the ground crying, my dad throwing paint on some random garage, everyone's just unwell. The police finally get a hold of us and said, okay, can you come down to the station? So I'm like, who am I gonna bring with me? Like, who's my safe place? Because everyone here's off their rocker. My stepmom's best friend, Ronnie, who I'm still close to today, went with me. He was one of the bikers that was there. So we go there, we sit down. They say, we interviewed Sean. He led us exactly to the body. He did kill your stepmom, and he burnt the body in a rural area. But the good thing about that, and I've seen a lot of cases where, in domestic violence, there's not a lot of convictions. It's very hard to convict. Even before the murder part, you know, just it's very hard to convict. And the fact that he didn't try to lie and didn't try to go to trial or fight it, you know, but how you led the cops to the body, so you really can't. That happened, and then it was just getting on with your life, which I remember I didn't cry. The trauma and the magnitude of what I was facing, it just took over, and I was in survival mode. I'm like, if I succumb to this pain, I'm gonna not be well. And so I just stuffed it and had to just survive and not let it take me. And I had a baby I had to be okay for, and that has been the catalyst of the last 14 years of my life. Is it just a year ago I started to process all this.
I read a couple articles about the case and about what happened with your mom and her said boyfriend. And one thing noted is that he pled guilty.
Yeah, immediately. Yeah.
Immediately pled guilty, but he said that he took the gun from her and the gun just happened to go off.
Yes.
And then he just happened to put her body in a car and just happened to drive it to a rural area and happened to catch it on fire.
Yes. Now
it's amazing how things happened.
And he killed her a day before he burned the body. Yeah. So what we've learned from the police report and from the trial after. So when he pled guilty, he had to make a statement. What I'm learning is a lot of that time is a blur for me. I know most information, but then some things I'm like, oh, I don't know exactly how it played out. So my best recollection is somebody did a statement. I think it was his own voice, if I remember correctly. And he said that they were arguing about he didn't want to be in a relationship with her, that he wanted no commitment or whatever. And they were arguing about that. And in that argument, she somehow wanted to, I guess, pretend like she wasn't afraid of this man. So she said, you know, I've dealt with my ex-husband before. In his addiction, he's pulled guns on me. He's done this. You don't scare me. And went to the closet and got his deer rifle. What is weird about that to me is my stepmom was 5 foot, maybe 5'1", barely. And a deer rifle is pretty long. So you're like, I'm not saying that it didn't happen. One of those things is we're never going to know. Only he knows. Only God knows. So if that was the case, it could be. You know, they were both, it came out later, they were both on drugs at the time. Not an excuse, but they were drinking also. So all these things plays a factor in your mindset. He said that he went to like fight her to take it from her and it went off. And then after I text him, I'm going to the police, that's when he burnt the body, like after I text him. And that is is something I had to work with myself, because I'm like, okay, guy, like, you have to already give me trauma, but now I know for a fact that you tried to cover your tracks because I threatened your plan here.
With violence against women and intimate partner violence, domestic violence, I can see already a pattern of abuse with your mom's former boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that isolation.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that love bombing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt in my mind that there was some trauma going on with the intimate partner violence with this person.
Yeah, she's been gone 14 years. Before I started my own healing journey and processing my trauma to really unpack everything, which is very scary. You don't want to unpack. These are like really serious, painful things. So when you finally dive headfirst into the pain and trauma, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to become one with it so I can understand it and do better. I've realized that I wish I knew more of their dynamic because they didn't date very long. She did know that he had tendencies. And this is something that gets me about domestic violence cases, is because he got second-degree murder because they said they couldn't say that it was premeditated. But he's had, maybe not charges, I don't know exactly the logistics of his previous run-ins with the law, but I do know that the Cameron Police Department knew him well. They've had run-ins with him. He's had abusive behaviors towards his ex-wife or ex-mother of his children and his children. And my stepmom knew that. But I think when you date someone, first of all, abusers are very great. Like, they know what they're doing. They're not going to come in with their mask off, right? They're going to have the mask on. They're going to be charming. Most of them are charming. It helps their narrative. He probably had an excuse or a story or wasn't like that or whatever, and you believe them, or you think it won't happen to you or it won't happen again, or you can be the one to help them, help their tendencies, whatever. And that was with my dad. I mean, you have to remember, my dad was a good man. I will say my dad was a good man, but he had a really ugly addiction, and that sometimes takes precedent over who you really are as a person. Now, do I believe that he abused my stepmom on a regular basis? No, I don't think my dad did that. He was drunk or high on pills on a regular basis. So I don't also know that dynamic either, but from what I've learned about DV abuse in the past 14 years after this, I can say, yeah, she felt, I think, more validated and felt more loved by helping them, by getting them out of their darkness, or so she thought, not realizing it was in detriment to not only her well-being, but her life.
And as you're trying to process this, tell me about your decisions and your relationships, because again, you're an 18-year-old young person at this time trying to process all of this trauma.
Yeah, and I didn't process it.
Right.
I buried it, and
that would be the issue.
Yes, that is exactly what the issue was. When that happened at 18, I had never had healthy, loving relationships. At that point, I had only been with my first boyfriend for a couple months before I got pregnant, and then we broke up when I was a couple months pregnant. So I didn't have like a history of healthy relationships or even a dating experience before her death. So I always say, I'm 32 years old. I still have never been in love. I've never been in a healthy relationship. And that's because life broke my heart at that moment when she left. So there was no room for me to let anyone in because heart was shattered. That is why I think I've chose men that have not been that great. I never looked in relationships for feeling good about myself. I've looked into relationships for the semantics. So like my ex-husband, I was not even interested in him. He kind of just bothered me on Facebook and just kept being persistent, and I wasn't even like attracted to him or interested. But I'm a single mom, and I see this guy who is persistently trying to pursue me, and he comes from a good family, and he's a blue-collar worker, and I didn't try to get to know him or see like if we're compatible or if we have the same likes, dislikes, morals, integrity. I just looked at, can you get me an easier life? I've never been in a relationship for love. It's always been kind of like a chess move, and I've always chose the wrong partners. But you know, I always say, when you don't unpack your trauma, you are just running on fight or flight, survival mode. You're not making choices for your best. I didn't love myself. I was so heartbroken from life. I shut down, and I made moves in my life that were just to make my life easier and get through everything I was burying inside, not because they were good moves. And it wasn't until 31 years old, had both parents be murdered, dealing with my ex-husband in a narcissistic co-parenting. Once you leave the narcissist abuse, it doesn't stop, especially with children together. I was really down a year ago. I wanted to take my life. I didn't think that I was worthy. I was struggling financially. My children were struggling. And I'm like, what am I doing here? I'm not proud of who I am. I'm not looking in the mirror happy. I'm not living my life the way that I know that I should be living it. I went to a mental facility for 5 days, and I got out, and I ever since then, I've just been putting my feet to the ground, and I knew then that there were so many things that I thought I had overcome, like my stepmom's death and all this trauma. By burying it, I thought it was fine, but it was manifesting negatively in my whole life. So when I took control and started being like, okay, this is going to be really hard, and it has been the hardest year of my life, but it's been the most necessary year of my life, if that makes sense.
So you started a podcast called Unhealed.
I did. I started that a month ago. I think we had our month birthday June 1st.
Tell me about the topics you're throwing yourself into and how that is helping with your healing journey.
Yeah. I had always wanted to be an author or a radio DJ. I mean, I just knew that I've always had a voice. I've always suppressed my voice. I've always had to. Life kind of took control of that. All of the years, if I would have just started to unpack what's happened to me, I could have gotten control of it a lot sooner. So Unhealed is about that. It's about no matter what you go through in life, you can always turn it around. You have to face, your trauma head on because you can't bury it. It's going to come out in other areas. And like me, it was a decade later. And I was like, oh gosh, how did we get here? Unhealed has been my saving grace. I'm talking about really hard things. I'm talking about my parents' murders. Almost every episode, there's some kind of domestic violence component. That is very, very important to me. My dad was murdered as well. For whatever reason, my stepmoms and then just the domestic violence part, probably because I've then had adult relationships where I've been a victim of abuse. And so I think it's just become so prevalent to me that it's my purpose. I have men that reach out to me and say, I resonate with your podcast because of the addiction part. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I'm 3 months sober from alcohol. I have women reach out to me, and not even maybe on the domestic violence side, but just on the single mom side. And it's just become a community. I honestly thought I was going to release this and it was going to be just for me. I didn't think people were really going to resonate with it.
Do you feel comfortable talking about your dad's murder?
Yeah, we could talk about that. So, as I mentioned, he was an addict my whole life. And he actually, before I was born, fell off a Navy ship when he was 21. He was in the Navy. That's what started his addiction on pain pills. That was in the late 80s. Doctors just prescribed those things. He had a neighbor, so it was like a small country road. There was like 3 little identical houses on this road. The landlord, and then my dad was a bachelor, and then he had a man his age that was a bachelor right next to him. They would barbecue, drink together, whatever. And this one night, they were next door at the guy's house. It was like 2 a.m. They'd been drinking and partaking in whatever drugs. So the guy said somehow things went left. My dad got aggressive, started charging him. They both had guns, but they were holstered. But my dad's gun never was off the holster. But because in the state of Missouri, he's charging at this guy in this guy's house. This guy unloaded his clip on him. Then he passed out. Then he woke up at 10 a.m., went to the gas station. So 2 a.m., my dad dies. No air conditioner, July. The guy left. Your body stops breaking down all the toxins. But when you're passed out in a gas station, you're breaking down your toxins. So by the time they got to this guy, they got my dad's body. They finally got a warrant. He still had a high tox report, but it wasn't nothing like my dad's because this guy's had hours to sleep it off. So after 2 years of the guy being in jail waiting on trial, they had a jury trial and they found the guy not guilty. The state of Missouri is a self-defense state. My dad's toxicology report was all through the charge. They interviewed us. I was on the stand. I had to be honest. He's charged at me drunk and high before. I think maybe that's why I have a little bit more closure with his death. Not that I don't want to say murder is anybody's fault. It's not. For whatever reason, it doesn't strike me or hurt me as badly as my stepmom. But my dad wasn't my day-to-day parent. My emotions with it, I immediately broke down. But I had just left my ex-husband 2 days before my dad died. I had just turned 27. He died 2 days after my birthday. And it was like an immediate, not again. Both parent, it was like, I didn't wait 6 months to cry. I had a lot going on then too. It's like both of those incidents of my parents' murders, I've had a lot of life going on at the time. And I don't know if that's set up for a reason, if I needed that distraction.
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's okay to have different reactions to trauma and to the
100%.
situations that are going on in your life. There's no right or wrong way to experience pain and the grief that you had. And so you also have different life experiences at the age 27 than you did at 18. Also having that experience of your stepmom, then your dad, you're going to have different reactions because you've had not only the life, but you had that previous trauma that you had already experienced. So there isn't a right or wrong. I think that's one of of the things that we see is like, what's wrong with her? She's not reacting to this situation. Like, everybody processes differently.
Yeah.
And you do it based on what you have internally available to you. And you also are surviving through these too. So the tools in your tool chest are going to be different than the tools someone else's. Can you talk about your siblings? So like after your stepmom was murdered, they were still pretty young, and you were young.
Yes.
Did your dad take custody again, or
no?
Were you responsible for that?
Grief hits everyone differently, and even though my stepmom was not my biological mother, her family has always treated me like their grandchild, my grandparents. I was 5 when my sister came along. So for the first 2 years of my dad and stepmom's relationship, I was the only child. Her parents took me in as their only grandchild. Then the other siblings came. But for whatever reason, the grief of her death, they kind of shunned me for a little bit. I think a lot of it was my dad. He was fighting them in custody that he did not win. My stepmom got our childhood home in the divorce, but when she died, my dad moved back immediately. Was he still not sober? Yes. But he did move back. So its best friend of my stepmom was living there before the murder. So she's there. I'm there. Brother, sister, baby. My dad came. My grandparents got control of her estate, which they should have, and they sent us an eviction notice. That was my home since I was 11. And I went to my biological mom's, and this was right before Christmas. So she died November 4th. By Thanksgiving, I was booted. It dissipated. A year or two after her death, I understood. I never internalized that. But yeah, they evicted me. My grandparents got custody of my brothers and sisters. So they moved into the home. So my dad did try to get them. It just wasn't in his favor. So they raised my brother and sister. And now my siblings are, I'm 32, so my sister is 26, and my brother's 25, 24, something like that. So we're all in our mid-20s, 30s. My sister struggled with addiction. I've struggled with alcoholism. And my brother's just struggled with being the baby and having his mom taken. My brother does have issues with, he's afraid of guns. We all kind of are. But it makes sense. Both of our parents died at the hand of a gun.
What I find fascinating is both of your parents that were murdered. Somebody else tried to speak for them. But now that you are processing and you're unpacking, you can be a voice for them. I think that is an amazing thing when a survivor uses her voice. Anna, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today and sharing your story, and I encourage you to keep using your voice.
Thank you. I intend to.